and whichever may take the floor first. It's lovely to have you. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. So, good morning. I'm Clémentine Daubet from KEA European Affairs. So first, I will start our presentation with the objectives of our study that will also structure the way we present. First, we've been commissioned to carry out a desk research of available data concerning the mobility of cultural and creative professionals in Europe in order to get an overview of the objective, the characteristics of the mobility, as well as key obstacles that prevent those professionals from moving about, across borders. Secondly, we have critically assessed the proposal for the new Creative Europe programme regarding only the mobility dimension to envisage potential synergies with the European policies and funds. We've looked at the work of the Open Method of Coordination Working Group on Mobility Support Programs initiated in 2011. And finally, we put forward some recommendations toward a European framework, a dedicated framework to mobility in the cultural and creative sectors in the context of the multi-annual financial framework. Our desk research has highlighted the importance of mobility in the cultural and creative sectors, first for the professionals themselves, because mobility allows them to exchange knowledge, values, and work practices across Europe. It's mobility, as we define it, is the temporary cross-border movement of artists and cultural and creative professionals that is not only an occasional movement, but really part of their regular working lives on international markets. Mobility allows them to enrich their professional experiences abroad and increase employment opportunities. We've also seen that in a changing context of economic pressure and evolving work patterns across the sector, with the rise of entrepreneurship, for instance, professionals need to be equipped with new skills. Therefore, mobility also allows them to learn, train, and build capacity and network internationally, which is very important to develop their professional capacities. We see that mobility practices are evolving towards lighter, more flexible, and shorter mobility forms. So mobility is not only about residencies, although this is a lot of mobility opportunities. Those residencies are also evolving towards more multidisciplinarity, being also more innovative, working with other sectors such as science and health. There are also a rise of workshops, incubation programs, peer-to-peer learning that are what we call those new mobility forms. If we look at local and regional levels, mobility positively impacts creative ecosystems. They nurture vibrant communities and contribute to open, innovative societies and economies. This is also why a number of mobility initiatives are supported by cities and regions. Mobility is also about international cultural relations, international dialogue, and ultimately trade in the cultural and creative sectors. Finally, we've seen that cultural mobility also contributes to European integration and fostering a sense of belonging to a common cultural space. It's also a way of leveling disparities that exist in the support to the cultural and creative sectors across Europe, as we will see a bit later in the presentation, and therefore avoiding leaving blank spots in the cultural infrastructure. And finally, it's also a catalyst to bring citizens together through participation in cultural projects and manifestation, bringing them a diversity of cultural expressions and therefore bringing about cultural awareness. I will hand over to my colleague to present the support that has been given to mobility in at the European level.
Okay, so given the manifold impacts that mobility has on wider society and economy, as my colleague just mentioned, the topic of mobility was gradually streamlined across several EU policy areas, ranging from foreign and neighborhood policy to EU single market or research innovation. As for example, the Service for Foreign Policy Instruments, which set up the cultural diplomacy platform in the wider context of the EU strategy for international cultural relations, offer several possibilities for mobility of cultural entrepreneurs. Sorry. Okay. Another example is COSME, which is the dedicated EU program for competitiveness of SMEs and entrepreneurship, has gradually achieved important mobility dimension via several initiatives that it promoted and acquired and supported along this last financial period. Also, Horizon 2020, which is the dedicated program for research and innovation at EU level, has supported several projects that promote mobility in the cultural and creative sectors. Also, another important aspect is that the 2007 European Agenda for Culture has basically opened a new chapter of coordination between EU member states, precisely on the topic of mobility, via the open method of coordination. So as such, between 2011 and 2014, there were 3 working groups of EU member states experts who worked precisely on specific issues related to mobility. The important findings that these groups provided are also used in our study, and they're also used to advance policy work on mobility issues at EU level. Regarding the latest development and also the future policy actions, it is newsworthy to mention that the new European Agenda for Culture, which was launched in May 2018, aims to further strengthen mobility in the cultural and creative sectors. And to do so, it considers the development of a dedicated framework for mobility in the field of culture, and also it considers the launch of a pilot mobility scheme in the current Creative Europe program, which is basically due this year. Another important aspect is the Commission's proposal for the new Creative Europe program, which I will discuss briefly later on. At the same time, unfortunately, mobility is still hampered by several issues regarding regulations, socioeconomic context across Europe. So, for example, the regulations regarding social security and taxations are not harmonized at the member states level, and also they don't generally take into consideration the work specificities of artists and cultural professionals. So, for example, there is still no clear definition of what an artist does or is, and the EU legislation. So given the inherent dynamic of the work of an artist, for example, it is common that an artist might be subjected to several legal statuses, as for example employed and self-employed at the same time, which basically lowers the level of social protection in situations of mobility. Also, in a wider political context, the latest developments such as the resurgence of nationalism across Europe or Brexit may hamper mobility in the cultural and creative sectors via funding cuts to cultural organizations, for example, or via imposing additional administrative burdens or fees on culture professionals in situations post-Brexit, for instance. And I will let my colleague Clémentine to present the situation at regional and local levels.
So we've identified that there's a need for a more cohesive approach at European level, also because there are numerous programs that exist at local and regional and national levels, but those are still fragmented. If we look at the global picture, those programs are you can find them more in the northern Western Europe. So those geographical imbalances need to be tackled to really promote and enhance the mobility in the cultural sector. And they are also dependent, those programs supporting mobility are dependent on national funding and therefore subject to political fluctuations, as well as recalled by my colleague. And we've seen more mobility programs supporting artists than cultural and creative entrepreneurs as such. So there is also a need to complement on those numerous and yet successful programs.
In what concerns the support at EU level, as I already mentioned, while there are opportunities for mobility, they are generally scattered and not connected by a clear strategy to push forward and to strengthen mobility in the cultural and creative sector. So, as you know, the bulk of the EU support comes from Creative Europe, but at the same time, programs like COSME or Horizon 2020 support several opportunities, give several opportunities to mobility. However, these opportunities are not visible to cultural and creative entrepreneurs, given the fact that these opportunities basically serve other EU policy objectives such as innovation or competitiveness of SMEs. Erasmus Plus, for example, offers other opportunities for mobility. However, they are generally limited to students or to young creative entrepreneurs under the age of 30. In what concerns the international dimension, initiatives like the Eastern Partnership or Cultural Diplomacy Platform offer different opportunities. However, they are not continued by a clear strategy, and as such, they are not the results of these opportunities are not continued and further deepened on a longer term. Also, in what concerns the mobility in the new Creative Europe program, the proposal for the Commission further acknowledges that more needs to be done, and also out of this, strengthening the cross-border circulation of cultural operators becomes the first priority of the future culture sub-program. However, we don't know exactly how this priority will benefit mobility. We don't know if there's going to be a single dedicated action or if mobility will be streamlined across several support actions, as we already had in the current program. However, might be the case, actually, we feel that there is the need to strengthen the idea that there is the need for a dedicated framework for mobility at EU level, which will basically act as a standalone measure to support and push forward different EU policy objectives, such as promoting cultural diversity, fostering career internationalization of cultural operators, or fostering social innovation. I will let my colleague to present our per se recommendation of our study.
Very briefly on the recommendations. So our report proposes two sets of recommendations for EU policy dedicated to mobility in the cultural and creative sectors. First, a dedicated scheme that would be complementary to those existing schemes at local and regional, national levels, and providing real added value in the way that it supports the internationalization of the sector within the European space, but also with third countries. It also is aligned on EU policies on innovation and entrepreneurship. It also proposes to scale up on those national and local schemes to generate social and economic innovation in the sector and support the internationalization through networking and collaboration. Second, better coordination at EU member state level and consultation with the stakeholders, for instance, through the structured dialogue with the cultural sector, and as well to bring down regulatory obstacles based on the work that professional associations have been doing now for a while on visa regulation, for instance. Finally, one sentence to conclude. We would like, with this report, to call on the EU to address mobility and enhance mobility of artists and cultural sectors, not only because it's beneficial to a sector that represents 7.5% of the EU workforce, but also to create an integrated cultural space and celebrate our cultural diversity against the backdrop of the recent political developments. Thank you.
Thank you.